There's this constant belief that the best thing that can happen to China is to have a collapse of the Chinese Communist Party and have a democratic system. The one slightly provocative point I'm going to make here is be careful what you wish for. Because if the Chinese political system becomes more democratic, it could very well become far more nationalist and far more aggressive as a power. And the great paradox here is that the Chinese Communist Party is actually delivering a global public good by restraining Chinese nationalism. That countries are now preparing for a world in which the United States will no longer be number one. So if you want to have that world to be a peaceful and orderly one, the time has therefore come for the United States to ask a very simple question. Would the United States feel comfortable living in a world where China behaves just as America did when it was a sole superpower?
大家好，我是老吴。今天这期节目，我们又来分享马凯硕的演讲。在我的频道里，他是出现频率最高的一位嘉宾。原因很简单，我个人非常欣赏他。我觉得马凯硕是少有的真正具备全球视野的思想家。他立足于新加坡，既深刻理解东方，也完全熟悉西方的运作逻辑。最难得的是，他始终保持理性、中立，不刻意迎合任何一方。在中美激烈对抗的当下，他敢对美国讲逆耳的忠言，也能用西方听得懂的语言把复杂的道理讲清楚。在之前的评论区，我看到不少观众对马凯硕的精彩点评。今天我想借这个机会集中回应几种常见的看法。最常见的是夸赞，这个就不多说了，我重点想聊的是另外三种。第一种观点说马凯硕是亲中派，在替中国说好话。我的看法是，如果非要说立场，那他唯一的立场就是亲新加坡。就像新加坡前总理李显龙常说的那句话，大象打架草地遭殃，大象亲热草地也一样遭殃。马凯硕曾对媒体说，对新加坡来说不是亲中或亲美的问题，而是如何活下去。对于新加坡这样的小国来说，最不希望看到的就是中美两个大国发生激烈的对抗。所以马凯硕的核心诉求是为地区降温，是劝架。我频道里分享的其他一些新加坡领导人的观点，其实也都是从这个立场出发的。所以有时候他们看起来亲中，有时候又显得亲美，这完全取决于他们认为哪一方的行为不利于新加坡的利益。我也在不少视频中看到马凯硕对美国的很多赞扬，也看到过他对中国的批评。而我分享的视频大多是他试图让西方世界更好地了解中国的角度，所以从这个角度看，确实会让人觉得他好像是在对中国的立场上说话。但我认为他的立场和出发点始终是新加坡国家利益优先，我觉得这完全合理。第二种看法说马凯硕对西方的批评不够犀利，不如萨克斯教授那样一针见血。我觉得这就有点对马凯硕太苛求了。你设想一下，他被西方人邀请去做演讲，作为客人不能一上来就指着主人的鼻子骂一通，他用那种平和理性的方式把尖锐的道理讲清楚，还能让人听进去，这本身就是一种智慧，也是一种勇气。而且萨克斯教授是美国人，批评的是自己的国家，那属于内部反思。而马凯硕再怎么独立，身份上还是代表着亚洲国家的视角。更现实一点是，现在像萨克斯这样敢猛烈批评美国的学者，已经越来越难登上西方主流媒体了。这也说明马凯硕这种柔中带刚的方式，可能在当下是更有效的沟通策略。第三种看法是对中国有点失望，说我们这么大的国家，怎么就没有一个像马凯硕那样的人能在国际舞台上为我们发声？这个问题我也有几点个人看法。第一，体量和战略重心不同。新加坡是小国，必须优先处理好对外关系，而中国是超级大国，最重要的是处理好14亿人的内部事务。第二是治理能力和沟通能力的权衡，西方政客普遍口才了得，镜头前滔滔不绝，但国家治理却每况愈下。如果只能二选一，我相信大多数中国人会更看重一个治理能力强的领导者，而不是一个光会说的沟通高手。当然，如果能两者兼备，当然更好。第三是历史和语言的差异，英语是新加坡的官方语言，整个精英教育和外交体系都是和西方接轨的，而中国的专家即使学贯中西，在跨文化表达上天然就隔着一层，这需要几代人的时间去磨合和积累。 第四，其实我们国内也有不少优秀专家，只不过有的英语不够好，有的表达能力稍弱，哪怕两者都具备，西方也未必愿意给他们一个平等的舞台。现实是，就算他们给舞台，也常常带着猎奇、审视，甚至羞辱的心态，而不是真的想对话。如果你认可我的看法，请点赞、评论或者转发。另外也提醒一下新来的朋友，如果你想第一时间收到节目更新，请记得订阅并打开小铃铛。最后我还想回应一下关于老视频的问题，经常看到留言说我用老视频来骗流量，但我觉得真正经典内容是经得起时间考验的。现在回头看，不但能验证当年的判断，有时甚至比当年看更有味道。况且很多视频我自己之前也没看过，相信很多朋友之前也没有看过，所以我觉得好东西不怕晚，经典的东西也值得反复看。好了，今天的题外话有点多，我们还是回到正题。这场演讲是马凯硕先生在2015年，也就是10年前，在哈佛大学肯尼迪学院的演讲。那么10年前的马凯硕是怎么回答当中国成为世界第一时会发生什么这个问题的？我们一起来听听看。
The way I'm going to deliver my remarks is that I'm going to first tell you 3 stories from the financial sector, and then later at the conclusion I'll explain to you why these 3 stories are important. And in terms of explaining and trying to answer the question, I'll first try to answer the question, of course, what are China's goals and aspirations as it tries to emerge and rise? Secondly, how has the relationship between the United States and China played a role in influencing the rise of China? And finally, try to make the point, and which is, I guess, the critical point I'm going to make at the very end, that how China behaves as number one will be very strongly influenced by how America behaves as number one. And that's why these 3 stories are important, and this is why I'll begin with them. The first story is about an event that happened at the height of the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. And until that financial crisis came about, the Chinese were very happy that they had developed an interdependent relationship with the United States of America, so that while China relied on America to sell its exports and to buy its products, America in turn relied on China to buy U.S. Treasury bills and to make sure that the U.S. could continue to sell these Treasury bills overseas. So they both felt that, as Tom Friedman said in one of his columns, that they were joined at the hip in a mutually interdependent relationship. And indeed, I can tell you this, as a matter of fact, at the height of the crisis, when things looked really bad, the Bush administration actually sent an envoy to Beijing in 2008 and said, please continue buying US Treasury bills, because that's what we need to preserve global financial stability. And the Chinese were happy to do so, and I suspect the Chinese even felt a bit smug. See, the Americans depend on us. But then, lo and behold, about a month later, in a move that completely shocked the Chinese, the US Fed announced the first round of QE measures in November 2008. And as you know, with the QE measures, essentially the US could print money to buy US Treasury bills. And lo and behold, the Chinese said, what's happened to this interdependence? The Americans can just turn on the printing press and take away this dependence on China. And indeed, one commentator at Exfil Merck said, the US is no longer focusing on the quality of its treasuries. In the past, Washington sought to promote a strong dollar through sound fiscal management. Today, however, policymakers are simply printing greenbacks. And Merck said that by relying on the Federal Reserve's printing press, the US has effectively told other nations, it's our dollar, but it's your problem. So that's one story about the financial relationship between US and China. Then you mentioned a second story from the financial world, which I think not many people notice. Now, I think you must have heard that the United States has been prosecuting several foreign banks, including HSBC, RBS, UBS, Credit Suisse, and Standard Chartered. Now, for example, Standard Chartered Bank was fined $340 million for making payments to Iran. And most Americans reacted with equanimity to this fine paid by Standard Chartered Bank and thought that the bank was just being fined for dealing with the evil Iranian regime. However, few Americans actually noticed that Standard Chartered Bank, which was domiciled in the UK, had broken no British laws and had not violated any UN Security Council sanctions, but because the payments made through the Standard Chartered system went through the New York clearing system, the US dollars entered the territory of US laws, and so Standard Chartered Bank was fined. And this is what is called, by the way, extraterritorial application of domestic laws. Again, remember this story when I come to the conclusion. And the third story is about the SWIFT system, SWIFT. I think many of you may know what it is. It's a system for clearing payments between countries. I think it's centered in Brussels. And when things got very rough between the United States and Russia recently, as you know, the United States said that it might consider denying access to Russia to the SWIFT system. And in a column by Farid Zakaria, one of our mutual friends, a graduate of Harvard, he described the Russian reaction to the possibility of being denied access to the SWIFT system. And interestingly enough, most of us, when you look at Russia, we think Putin is the bad guy, Medvedev is a nice guy, good guy. But there was a good guy, Medvedev, who said, the Russian response to any denial of access to SWIFT will know no limits. So clearly, again, this was a global system for clearing payments, and the United States was trying to use it for either for bilateral relations in terms of punishing Russia. Now, these are the three stories I'm telling you at the beginning, and I'm going to conclude with these stories at the end. Now, first of all, let me now answer the three questions that I mentioned earlier. First, what are China's goals and aspirations as it emerges as number one? And here, the most obvious point that I need to make and emphasize at the outset is that even though China, as you know, is still run by the Chinese Communist Party, I can assure you one thing: the Chinese leaders, unlike Stalin or Lenin or Khrushchev, have no desire to prove the superiority of the communist system. In fact, as you know, Khrushchev famously said in November 1956, whether you like it or not, history is on our side, we will bury you. Now, the Chinese don't have the kind of aspirations that the Russians had to in any way prove the superiority of the communist ideology. So if it's not communism that they're trying to promote, what is it they're trying to promote? And the simple answer is that they would just like to revive Chinese civilization. Indeed, if there's one thing that motivates the Chinese leaders, it is their memory of the many humiliations that China has suffered for over a century, as you know, from 1842, the Opium War, to roughly 1949, or you can even go beyond that. And the one thing that drives the Chinese is a simple credo which says, no more humiliation for China. That's the great motivation. And indeed, Xi Jinping, when he spoke to UNESCO in March 2014, this is what he said are the goals of the Chinese people. He said the Chinese people are striving to fulfill the Chinese dream of the great renewal of the Chinese nation. The Chinese dream is about the prosperity of the country, the rejuvenation of the nation, and the happiness of the people. It reflects both the ideal of the Chinese people today and our time-honored tradition to seek constant progress. The Chinese dream will be realized through balanced development and mutual reinforcement of material and cultural progress. Without the continuation and development of civilization or the promotion and prosperity of culture, the Chinese dream will not come true." Unquote. And I think in those few sentences, he brilliantly captured what is the heart of the aspirations of the Chinese people, to move away from an era of having been humiliated for a long time to an era where they once again feel proud about Chinese civilization and what it can accomplish. And indeed, if the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, could change its name to CCP, the Chinese Civilization Party, then I think it would be a more accurate description of the goals and aspirations of the CCP. But of course, while this may be the motivations, many in the West continue to believe that China's approach is flawed because it is not changing its political system. And you can read in, whatever, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Economist, there's this constant belief that the best thing that can happen to China is to have a collapse of the Chinese Communist Party and have a democratic system. The one slightly provocative point I'm going to make here is be careful what you wish for. Because if the Chinese political system becomes more democratic, it could very well become far more nationalist and far more aggressive as a power. And the great paradox here is that the Chinese Communist Party is actually delivering a global public good by restraining Chinese nationalism. And if you didn't have a strong Chinese Communist Party in charge, you might actually get a more nationalist, a more assertive China. So I believe that it's actually in global interest to allow the Chinese Communist Party to evolve and change in its own way. And that way, I think we will have a China that focuses on economic growth and focuses on strengthening its civilization. Let me now turn to the second question I said I would discuss, which is US-China relations, because clearly the relationship between the world's number one power, which today is United States, and the world's number one emerging power, China, is a key dynamic. And here, it is actually remarkable how stable the US-China relationship is. In theory, when the world's number one emerging power is about to surpass the world's number one power, and as you know, in PPP terms, China did surpass the United States in 2014, you should be seeing naturally, logically, and I think Steve Wall might agree, rising levels of tension between US and China. But instead, quite remarkably, we're seeing a very stable and indeed a calm relationship. And of course, the question is why. And here I think we have to pay a lot of tribute to the United States for having managed very well the relationship with China. If indeed, the United States has been remarkably benign over the years towards China, starting from the days of 1990s. I mean, of course, starting, of course, from the Cold War and Kissinger's trip and America's efforts to bring China on board in the Cold War alliance against the Soviet Union, and then opening up the American market, as I mentioned earlier, to Chinese products. And even after the Tiananmen episode of 1989, when relations between US and China could have taken a nosedive, US-China relations continued on an even keel. Actually, I remember vividly in 1992 listening to the election speeches of Bill Clinton when he said famously in his campaign, "I will not coddle the butchers of Beijing if I become president of America." And when he became president, we could have very well seen a sharp nosedive in the relations between US and China. Instead, to my surprise, and I actually saw this in my own eyes, in November 1993, at the first APEC leaders meeting, which was held in Blake Island off Seattle, that's the first time that Bill Clinton and Jiang Zemin met face to face. And I could see that Jiang Zemin was incredibly uncomfortable, tense, and nervous, and trying to figure out what the US president would do to him in this small, close meeting where I was present. And to Jiang Zemin's surprise, and to my surprise, Bill Clinton coddled the butcher of Beijing. And it was a very wise decision on his part. And by the end of the day, if you had watched the body language of Jiang Zemin and Bill Clinton, amazingly, they were almost good friends at the end of the day, reflecting the great charm of Bill Clinton at the time. But this pattern has continued. United States has helped China by getting it into WTO. The United States has helped China by being sensitive on Taiwan, and indeed coming down very hard on the leaders of Taiwan when they tried to push for independence of Taiwan. So these are various ways in which the United States has demonstrated its wisdom and generosity towards the Chinese. And of course, speaking in Harvard University, I have to mention it is actually quite remarkable that the world's number one power is training the elite of the world's number one emerging power by allowing it to send 275,000 students to come and study in American universities. I think future historians will be wondering, why was America so generous in supporting the rise of its number one emerging power? But all this have led to this geopolitical miracle that we have today, where you have a stable relationship between US and China. And also, by the way, I also have to mention that Chinese themselves have been very careful and sensitive, and some from time to time actually bent over backwards to keep the relationship on an even keel. I was just in Belgrade literally 2 weeks ago, and it's the first time I've gone to a modern city and saw the results of bombing by NATO on skyscrapers. And of course, Belgrade is significant because, as you know, the Chinese embassy in Belgrade was bombed in 1999. Almost all Americans I speak to believe that it was obviously an accident. But 100% of the Chinese I've spoken to are convinced it was deliberate. But despite the fact of their belief that it's deliberate, they swallowed the humiliation and said, our relations with the US are far too important. We will swallow our humiliation this time and proceed. So both sides, you can see, have made an effort to keep the relationship on an even keel. So all this brings me to my third part. How American behavior and actions will have a significant influence on China's role as a number one power. And here I must confess to you, in all honesty, that even though I'm normally quite provocative in things I say, I feel a certain trepidation here in saying some of the things that I'm going to say in this section. Because as you know, very famously, Bob Zoellick, many years ago, called on China to emerge as a responsible stakeholder of the global system. But when he made that call, I think he assumed that, of course, the United States is a responsible stakeholder of the global system. And the hard part here is to try and tell an American audience that's not how the United States is often perceived overseas. And that's why I told the three stories from the financial sector at the beginning of my lecture, because the rest of the world quite often sees the United States acting unilaterally, acting in its own interests, and often at the expense of global interests. And David mentioned that I've been the ambassador to the UN twice. I was there. I've served there for almost 10 years. And it's rather tragic to watch in the UN, as I did at first hand, to see that the institutions that were essentially created by the United States after World War II, with the guidance of FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt and all that, these were basically American-inspired institutions which have then been undermined by American policies. And I think, in many ways, the United States has been very unwise in undermining these global institutions, because every action that the United States makes in undermining these global institutions could then be replicated by China. And that's why, in my latest book, The Great Convergence, I decided to begin the book by quoting from a very wise speech that Bill Clinton gave, am I allowed to mention Yale, in 2003. And this is what Bill Clinton said. If you believe that maintaining power and control and absolute freedom of movement and sovereignty is important to your country's future, there's nothing inconsistent in that. The US is the biggest and most powerful country in the world now. We've got the juice and we're going to use it. But then he added a but, Bill Clinton. He said, but if you believe we should be trying to create a world with rules and partnerships and habits of behavior that we would like to live in when we are no longer the military, political, economic superpower in the world, then you wouldn't do that. So Bill Clinton was being very wise in saying, as long as America thinks it'll be number one, yes, we can go on undermining multilateral institutions. But if we can conceive of a world in which we are number two, then surely it is in America's interest to strengthen multilateral rules and processes. But what is strange is that Bill Clinton only gave the speech once and never repeated that again. Because I'm told it's political suicide in America to speak about America being number two. So most politicians tend to veer away from that possibility. But I think the time has come for the United States to think very hard about a world in which it might become number two and China might become number one. Then surely America's interests change dramatically. And that's why, if America wants to see a China emerge that plays by global multilateral rules and processes, the best way it can do so is not by giving speeches or saying eloquent words about how you should preserve the global system. The best way you do it is through your deeds. And here, of course, I'm going to conclude by mentioning briefly the latest episode that has happened in US-China relations, and which is, of course, as you know, is the Chinese decision to set up an Asian infrastructure investment bank, which unwisely the United States decided to oppose. And as you know, and this is in many ways a sign of the times, in the past, a veto by Washington, D.C. would have meant that all the allies would have stood firmly behind the United States, and the United States veto would have held. But even to my surprise, the first country to break that veto was the number one ally of the United States, which is the United Kingdom. And that's a sign of the times, that countries are now preparing for a world in which the United States will no longer be number one. So if you want to have that world to be a peaceful and orderly one, the time has therefore come for the United States to ask a very simple question. Would the United States feel comfortable living in a world where China behaves just as America did when it was a sole superpower? Thank you.
好，马凯硕在2015年的这场演讲就分享到这里。虽然这已经是10年前的演讲，但今天再听反而更能体现出他的远见和洞察力。这场演讲他先讲了3个金融领域的故事，然后围绕3个核心问题展开分析，最后又用3个故事做了总结。他传达了几个很重要的观点。第一，他认为中国崛起的核心动力并不是输出意识形态，而是要实现中华文明的复兴，终结过去100多年的屈辱。他还特别指出，中国之所以能在崛起过程中保持稳定，是因为有一个强大的执政党，这反而在一定程度上压制了极端民族主义的声音。我觉得这个角度很独特，很多人没有意识到这一点。第二，他把当时中美关系的稳定归因于美国的善意和中国的克制。但坦白说，我个人觉得当时中美关系的稳定根本还是因为双方有共同的利益驱动，而不是靠什么善意。因为马克说自己常讲，地缘政治是非常现实和残酷的，核心就是国家利益。所以他在这部分说善意，我理解更像是一种对美方听众的礼貌说法，说点他们爱听的。第3点也是这场演讲的核心，他引用了克林顿的一段话：当美国不再是世界第一时，你最希望生活在一个什么样的世界里？如果你希望那个世界依然有规则、有秩序，那今天的你就应该带头遵守规则。他还举了亚投行的例子，说各国已开始为后美国时代做准备了。总的来说，这场演讲的本质是马凯硕用一种非常平和理性的方式在提醒当时的美国精英们，世界变了，旧的霸权逻辑该收一收了。如果美国不尽早转变心态，那他今天做的很多事儿，将来中国或其他崛起的国家也会学着做，到时候就不要说别人不讲规则了。好了，今天的分享就到这里，感谢大家的收看，我们下次再见。